George Trepal did not see eye to eye with his next door neighbours, the Carr family. He complained that they were loud, they were disrespectful, and they were undisciplined. George was a reserved man. He liked peace, he liked quiet, and the Carrs disrupted that frequently. When Peggy Carr became sick with some strange symptoms, her family initially didn't realise how serious the condition was. However, when her hair started to fall out and she fell into a coma, and more of the family started exhibiting similar symptoms, alarm bells started to ring. This, paired with the fact that it also received an anonymous threatening letter months earlier, led to the belief that they had been deliberately targeted. This is what happens when an underhanded, evil genius wants to get back at his noisy neighbours. This is the poisoning of the Carr family. Hi guys, welcome back to my channel. Thanks for joining me. For those of you who might think I'm sounding a little bit more nasally than usual, it's because I'm recovering from my nasal surgery. And I'm not gonna lie, I currently feel like the end of my nostrils is in some kind of vice, getting tighter and tighter. But as you all know, I will always release my content on a Wednesday and Sunday. So if you like crime and consistency and deep dives into this kind of content, this is definitely the channel for you. If you're new here, hello. And if you fancy it, why don't you subscribe and get your notifications on so you never miss one of my episodes. Also, for those of you on YouTube membership and Patreon, as you'll know, I am putting extra content out. I'm going to try and do more and more and more of this. I really want to up those areas of content. As ever, a massive thank you to all of you. Without you guys, I can't do this. Today's case, it's one of those. It may leave some of you with some questions. I would really like to know your thinking on this case. I would really like to know your thoughts on it. It's one of those that I'm not saying I'm conflicted over, but as I started to research it, I genuinely felt completely at peace with what I believe the result was and the verdict that was given. And I'm not saying I don't. I'm just saying that there are some bits and pieces in my mind that don't necessarily have clarity. I'd be really intrigued to know your thoughts when it comes down to this particular case. Let's look at the antagonist, so to speak, George Trepal in this case. So George Trepal was born January 23rd in 1949 in New York City. He was the son of a policeman, and also his mother was an elementary school teacher. So your box standard pro-social type parents as far as from looking from the outside in. I would say not a lot is known about his childhood, but apparently he was incredibly bright from the get-go, a really clever child. He attended Clemson University in South Carolina, and during his time graduating there, he studied chemistry for 2 years. Whilst he was in college, so this was in the 60s and early 70s, let's just say times were pretty free. It was the era of living and loving in a more free context and having a lot of drugs along the way to help you do just that. And he was, as many young people were, very into the drug scene back then. He apparently liked taking a lot of drugs personally, but he also liked to share them with others, sometimes with the other's consent, sometimes apparently without the other's consent. So he had a little bit of paranoia at points. He believed that other young people were coming into his dorm room when he wasn't necessarily around. So he decided it would be fun to coat the doorknob with hallucinogens. That would mean that the individuals who were going into his actual room would be absorbing the hallucinogenics into the skin, which would essentially tell them off to some degree on a very physical level. Now, I don't know about you. I may have purposefully and willfully gone and used that doorknob on several occasions of my own volition. Throwing it out there, when I was a young person, I made some bad choices. They would have been some of my bad choices. But arguably, it's very paranoid that he's thinking people are trespassing, but also, what a punishment. For example, whilst I'm poking fun at that reality, when you consider the impact that hallucinogenics can have on an individual, for the most part, people will not have a bad time. But part of the reasoning behind that is you are doing it of your own volition. You are taking a drug because actually it's something that you want to engage within, and you're going in for the experience, and you're prepared. If you are given a hallucinogenic and you have no idea that you have been given one, it is going to be absolutely terrifying. The impact that it can have on you can be deeply traumatic, and the consequences can be lifelong, genuinely. So when it comes down to this man doing that, even though he's, a young adult, so he's not formed and forged yet with the conscience he'll have ideally when he's older, he's still putting people at risk, and he's knowing that he's doing that. And it's a secretive knowing, isn't it? It's harboring that reality within his own mind and knowing that ultimately other people are going to come to some kind of harm, and he has a sense of power over that. Or because he believes, he doesn't have evidence for, but he believes that people may be going into his dorm room. So that's kind of a high-level assault with respect. You think about spiking in our modern day, that is going to potentially give you a prison sentence, and rightfully so. That's the behaviour he is engaging in back then. And another time, this is when he's apparently on a trip with a friend, they would pick up hitchhikers, because that was very much the time frame that they were living in then. People did hitch rides consistently. It's also why a lot of people have terrible tales to tell about what happened ultimately to hitchhikers, because clearly, shall we say, serial killers used to take advantage of that freedom that people felt they could have. So even though he isn't doing anything like that to the people who are getting into his car, he is giving them brownies or cookies that are laced with drugs. And he's doing that for one reason. He enjoyed seeing how it affected them. He enjoyed seeing how that made them react. It's about him having that control and then being out of control potentially, with him being the puppet master to some degree. So whilst some people can look at that and say, well, it was just hijinks, it was the time that they were living in, a lot of people would have engaged in silly behaviours like this. When we actually boil it down to what it truly is, it's assaulting another human being. And not just that, it's having that sense of sinister enjoyment as they struggle because they don't know what's happened to them. And I would say that's very malevolent within somebody's nature. Now, because he's bright, he doesn't struggle to get work. He worked as a computer programmer, and he then got married to a woman called Diana. Diana was very bright herself. She was an orthopedic surgeon, so clearly on a financial level they would have been doing very well. And he and Diana, shall we say, were on the bright side. So they were both members of Mensa. I'm sure a lot of you know what Mensa is, but it's basically a high IQ society for people who are over the age of 14, who are in the top 2% of intelligence. I wouldn't make it. Just putting it out there. I'm sure that some of you listening to this right now are members of Mensa. I guarantee I would not, in any way, shape and form, end up in the top 2% when it comes down to intelligence. You just have to give me a pretty average maths paper from maybe a 12-year-old and you'd understand why that's the case. But they are both in it, and in fact, their love story indeed begins at a Mensa meeting. What a better place to meet, surrounded by like-minded, clever people who are all in a society where they can agree that every single one of them in the room is clever. I wonder whether there's like a spectrum. Oh, you're in the top 2%. I was in the top 0.14%. So, I mean, you're in the same room, but are you actually in the same zone? I don't think so. You should go over in that corner where the canapes are specifically average for those in the 2% category lower band. Anyway, they connected. They get on with each other. Apparently they had a very strong marriage. Both of them were very intelligent people, of course. And according to people who knew George and Diana, she was quite a strong character. She was quite a loud character, ironically, when we are talking about the intricacies of this case. You wouldn't imagine that he'd have married somebody who was quite loud, because it's something that George really doesn't like. But Diana is quite a loud individual, and he's apparently quite a passive character, and he was very much behind her as she becomes quite ambitious within her career. So there isn't a lot of obvious conflict in the relationship. Apparently both of them had an absolute love of true crime and mysteries, so something George, Diana and myself and all of you have in common. But also they were said to get involved in doing things like studying police manuals. He believed that he really understood the forensic side of crime scene procedures. And as a couple, one of the things that they used to enjoy doing was they used to stage murder mystery weekends. But these weren't any ordinary murder mystery weekends. These were Mensa's murder mystery weekends. These were weekends where only clever people got murdered. Obviously, not really, but in a group. So that's what they did. They staged murder mystery weekends. I imagine they were very elaborate. I imagine they were very challenging. And I imagine it wasn't quickly a case of who done it. But apparently they'd stage these elaborate homicides and then they'd lead the guests through the clues to solve them. So they like figuring these things out, and the mindset of George and Diana is such that they are intrigued, shall we say, by the area of crime, full stop. Now, George's friends describe him as quite a shy person, quite a reserved person, and one of the things that they noted was that when he was a child, it was quite challenging for him because he was extremely gifted. And what we know psychologically in the research around gifted children is, on one level, it can be quite amazing, of course, when you have a child who's unbelievable at maths or physics at the age of 5, or can play a piano at the age of 3 in the way that some amazing composer would be able to play. It's one of those things that we celebrate, but we often fail to understand the consequences for the child. And like I said, whilst it's wonderful to be praised and to be raised up by your adult peers, so to speak, it isn't quite the same for the child and the experience, because obviously their brain at the development level is at a stage far greater to their peers, to their actual age, chronology-based peers. And that means that engaging and playing with those individuals is quite challenging. Firstly, if you're a 5-year-old genius and other 5-year-olds have just got a bucket on their head and are running into the wall because it's fun, I'm not saying my kids did that, but they might have done that. The point is, it was fun. If a 5-year-old child had tried to sit with either of my sons at that age to talk about physics, I just think it would have been a confused look on their face before putting the bucket back on their head and then running back into the wall. That's how kids feel when something and somebody around them isn't making any sense to them. They're not involved, they're not interested, they're not engaged. But if you're the genius kid who wants to have relationships with other children, you're going to try and constantly find yourself not connecting. And that is troublesome. Also, children look at difference. It can be positive difference, it can be negative difference, but they notice it. And that means that when it comes down fundamentally to groups, often a very gifted child will be excluded from groups. So you might be quieter as a temperament, you might be brighter as a temperament, but then that makes it more difficult to engage anyway. And then you're isolated because the kids are kind of feeling that, for them, talking about something they don't have any understanding and comprehension of really isn't going to float their boat. So we know on a research level, experience of being gifted can also mean experience of feeling quite isolated. So we know from a get-go, one of the things that he's going to be able to use is his intelligence. We also know, because he joins Mensa, that he wants that reflection of intelligence. Even his choice of partner, she is an equal to him in that level. And that can show an insecurity, because it may mean that he feels that he has to be around people who reflect his worth academically. And it could be a sign of arrogance, that he only wants to move around people and with people who he feels are worthy of who he is. It could be either of those things. George and Diana, they moved to Alturas in Florida in the early 1980s, and they live next door to a family who is headed by Perilyn Carr, who calls himself Pi. That's the name he goes by. He and his family live next door to George and Diana Trepals. And his family is quite a busy household, so his family members included his son Travis, his 2 daughters Tammy and Julina, and his granddaughter Casey, so multi-generational family. And then there's Peggy and her son Dwayne. They move into that family home after they're married in March of 1988. So Pi and Peggy get married and they end up cohabiting at that address. Peggy also had another son, Alan, and a daughter, Sissy, from her previous marriage, though they didn't actually move into the Pi's home with her. Now, not long after Peggy and her son had moved in, Pi decided that he wanted to convert his detached garage into an apartment. And he wanted to do that because he had 2 daughters and also the 2-year-old Casey, so he wanted them to have some separate space. Now, George did not get on with his neighbours. He was not happy with the way that they acted. So there was conflict often because he didn't like the noise contamination, shall we say. He didn't like the level of noise which came from his next door neighbours. Also, he complained that the car's dogs had chased his cats, which ultimately is going to annoy you, particularly because a dog should be on a lead if they are the type of animal that's going to chase a cat, because that's actually something that can be quite dangerous, particularly if there are cars involved swerving to avoid dogs and cats in situations like that. So I do have total sympathy and empathy that if you had cats and your neighbour is just not keeping a dog on a leash and it's causing those issues, you're going to complain about it. When it comes down to noise, hey, we all live in neighbourhoods with different people, living different stories, with different expectations. Having a little bit of understanding and empathy that just because you live one way doesn't mean your neighbours have to live the same way is kind of helpful to just getting on with people. So on the 14th of June 1988, one of the things that happens to the Carr family, to Pye's family, is that they receive this anonymous threatening letter. And it's Dwayne, who was just 16 years old at the time, goes and picks up from the mailbox, and it reads, "You and all your so-called family have 2 weeks to move out of Florida forever, or else you'll all die. This is no joke." I would find that so chilling. You know, some people can say, well, it could be a prank, you've just got to take this as somebody being ridiculous, it's not real. But if I was sent a letter like that to my home, immediately I would speak to the police, because I would find that a very overt threat. And the fact that they're referring to so-called family, that feels really personal. It's not just, oh, get your family out of here. It's you and your so-called family. So somebody who is looking in and thinking, you're not even a real family. Maybe it's because they have been married before, and therefore, as the adult parents in the family, from the outside looking in, the person is judging and saying, well, actually, it's not a real family. It's a family that's got together after the failure of other marriages. So that feels really personal, but also saying you will die, and this isn't a joke. Then we get to October the 23rd, 1988. This is when Peggy starts getting really ill. So she's working at that point in time as a waitress, and she's on the job as a waitress that day, and she starts getting sick. Now, it's not immediately clear what's going on with her. She starts with breathing difficulties. She has chest pain. She has nausea, so really high-level symptoms. She also feels this really strange and unusual burning in her legs. Now, her husband, Pye, wasn't initially very sympathetic towards her ailments. In fact, he was saying it's likely that she was just standing up for so long at work, and that was why she was feeling like that. But eventually he did agree to take her to the hospital the following day. That does suggest that Pye is not very sympathetic. You know, if your partner is complaining about things that feel deeply unusual to them and they're struggling, then offering to take them to hospital immediately is probably the correct action. Equally, when we think about relationships, it can be that a partner moans regularly about ailments, and therefore you grow tired of it and frustrated with it. So when they do present with something serious, you don't take it as seriously, because in the prior experiences, everything's always been okay. Peggy is then taken to Bartow Memorial Hospital, and she literally said to the doctors that she felt like she was on fire. But in spite of the fact that she feels that unwell, she's sent home after 3 days, and doctors basically give her the age-old advice of just rest. My legs feel like they're on fire. Just rest. I can't breathe very well. Rest. I actually feel very, 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 very unwell. Just rest. Is that going to help me? I don't know. Rest and we'll see. But it must be frustrating because they can't determine what the symptoms are, but that's their course of action. Now, her symptoms did slightly improve while she was in hospital, but then when she gets home, she actually gets worse, significantly worse. So the 30th of October 1988, Peggy is taken to Winter Haven Hospital, and she's not alone because Dwayne and Travis have actually started exhibiting the same symptoms. So now this is affecting the family. Peggy's condition really does drastically deteriorate. She begins struggling to speak. Eventually, she wasn't even able to talk at all. So this must be unbelievably scary. Can you imagine being in a situation where you've known that something is wrong, you've not necessarily been taking that seriously, and all of a sudden you have literally lost the ability to even be able to communicate? And she was trying to communicate through sign language. Her hair had started to fall out. Now, there was a Dr. Richard Hostler. He's a neurologist who was basically treating the family because it's not just her who's unwell. Unfortunately, he recognised what he considered these strange symptoms were, and they were that of thallium poisoning. And that's not something you would routinely test for. So even though she had been tested on lots of different levels, they hadn't tested for thallium poisoning. Why would they? They then do further tests, and they do indeed confirm that this is exactly what Peggy, Dwayne, and Travis are suffering from. And even though the problem had then been identified and they started the treatment, bear in mind Peggy had been very ill. She was already gravely ill at the point that they discovered this, and she sadly ends up slipping into a coma. Tests were then carried out in the car home, and it's found that an 8-pack of Coca-Cola bottles in the house all contained thallium. Now, it's decided that it genuinely wouldn't be possible for 8 bottles containing thallium to be put in the same pack, because as it would work in the factory, that wouldn't be how it would occur. So you might get them in separate packs being affected by a particular batch, but it wouldn't be the same batch. And of course, when Coca-Cola were asked whether anybody else has reported thallium being discovered in their products, the individuals just slipping into comas randomly after having a drink, they said absolutely not. Nothing had been brought up to them. So that meant, on a common sense level, the contamination was extremely unlikely to have occurred on a manufacturing level. So therefore, they established that the pack of Coca-Cola, which had been poisoned, had actually not even been brought in to the household by a member of the Carr household. So after Coca-Cola are disputing the reality that they'd had anything to do with it, the actual Carr family are. They're saying, we didn't bring that in. None of us, when we've gone through, actually were responsible for bringing that 8-pack of Coca-Cola into the home. So this then leads to the subsequent belief that someone else had purchased the Coke, had added the poison, had replaced the bottle caps, and then left the bottles in the Carr's residence, which would mean that they could avoid detection personally. And on one level, you can think, well, why on earth would anybody drink bottles of Coca-Cola that just arrived in the house? Why wouldn't people think, who's left this? Why is this here? But this is a busy household. So if my son goes out and buys an 8-pack of Coca-Cola and puts it in the fridge, I will steal it. There is no doubt whatsoever. It will be stolen. I will have it because it's there. And if he's not present to stop me, I'm going to drink some of it. The point is, I'm not thinking, well, maybe somebody else has come in and put these in my fridge. You wouldn't do that. You just assume that a member of the household has brought it in, and therefore you have a right to take it, because we all know families always have a sense that everything that is everybody else's within their family is actually theirs. It's yours, but it's actually mine. You bought it, but actually you're living in my house, therefore I can consume it. So this is what they add up has happened to lead to the family members ingesting something that they weren't even aware they hadn't brought into the home themselves. They also assumed that Peggy had actually drank more of the Coca-Cola than her family members, and that means that she was exposed on 2 separate occasions, once before her hospitalisation, and then again when she returned home thinking that she was getting better. Dwayne and Travis, they'd also drank some of the Coke, but they hadn't drank as much as Peggy. And Pi, Jelena, and Casey, who was his 2-year-old granddaughter, they had actually consumed a small amount, but they hadn't drank enough so that they'd exhibit any symptoms of poisoning. And thank God that 2-year-old little girl didn't, because you can imagine, can't you, that they love fizzy drinks. I know they shouldn't have them at that age. We all know children of 2 shouldn't have fizzy drinks. We all know that a lot of them do, though. They do. And when it comes down to it, you're only going to need a small amount to kill a child. So thank God that gorgeous little girl didn't get affected in that way. We then get to December the 22nd, 1988. And obviously, the police are intrigued about how on earth this poisoning have happened. So they start to talk to neighbours. And obviously they speak to George because he lives next door. By this point, they've already spoken to over 50 other people. So they haven't pinpointed that he's a problem in this. They're just trying to find out as much information as possible about what could have taken place, whether people have seen anybody strange, and so on and so forth. So when they start asking him questions, it's genuinely just conducted as a matter of routine. But from the get-go, the police find him really strange. They feel quite suspicious of him straight away. So first of all, he appears to be very nervous. I get that. I think that we have to also acknowledge that he has a temperament that people talk about being quite quiet and sensitive. So the idea of suddenly having to answer questions to detectives, I am the kind of person that if you pull me over in my car and I've not had a drink, I'll still think I'm going to get found guilty just because at the end of the day, I instantly feel anxious when anybody in authority is in a position of power over me. I automatically feel guilty. I don't know what that's about. I know a lot of other people do resonate like that. My sister herself was once pulled over on a roundabout. She'd had like a drink of wine 3 days earlier and felt the need to tell the police officer that. I think it's genetic. I think it's a genetic thing within us, but a lot of you will relate. So I don't feel that because somebody is struggling when a detective is speaking to them, that is a sign of guilt. Often I just think that's a sign of anxiety. So George could just simply be anxious. But he does, shall we say, become forthcoming about the way he feels about the family cars next door. So he's got a lot of animosity towards the cars as a family. He got quite agitated, allegedly, when he was speaking about them. He talked about the disagreements. He said they were noisy neighbours. He also said that Pi tried to sell him everything but his wife. Well, it's good to know that at least he had some boundaries there. Arguably, this is hearsay, isn't it? That George is trying to paint his neighbours in a very bad light. And the suggestion that Pi has tried to sell him everything but his wife, maybe he was offering him certain things that he had, because at the end of the day, when it comes down to it in America, garage sales are quite popular. So it's not unusual for neighbours to have things that maybe they think another neighbour might want before they get rid of them. But this had obviously infuriated George. Also, he suggested that Pi had tried to take advantage of him and Diana. In one example, he said that they tried to sell him a barbecue that Pi had made himself. I don't think that's taking advantage. I mean, offering somebody, do you want to buy this barbecue I've made? No. Okay. You're taking advantage of me. I mean, I'm not, because you said no. It's fine. I made it myself. It's my home creation. It's better than a shop bought. I don't want the fact you've offered it me. That's taking advantage of me. Take your barbecue and all your extra additions, such as the charcoal and your homemade tongs, and go and do some barbecuing of your own meat, mates. Anyway, this is apparently something that really upset George. Maybe George has just got this idea of how people are meant to act as neighbours, and offering them things that you've actually created yourself and upcycled is not one of them. So to give you an example of this, in 1990, Diana wasn't too happy because she'd actually been sued for attacking a guest at a hotel where she was staying because she felt like they were playing the music too loudly. So she was just like, you know what, could just go down to the concierge and be like, room 701 is playing their music just a little bit too high for my liking. She was like, I'm going to take matters into my own hand. I'm just going to attack them physically. So on a patience level, obviously, she has quite an easy fraying of pensions. Also, for somebody who's allegedly in the top 2% of the population when it comes down to being clever, not the cleverest thing to do. Not your best day, particularly when you think about you being in the medical field, which could lead to you being struck off. But we're just splitting hairs here, aren't we, with my logical common sense, because I don't come from that top 2%. But arguably, we can see, as a couple, they probably feed each other's frustrations. They probably have a very small threshold when it comes down to being patient. And if anybody betrays that, there are going to be stern consequences. And they likely push each other further down that road because they agree with one another's perceptions. So he, at this point, is actually asked by the investigators, why would somebody want to poison the Carr family? And it's an understandable question. And George's response was that perhaps someone had wanted them to move out of their house. Well, seems like a very, very specific suggestion, George. I mean, that could be the reason. That you sound like you know quite. In light of the letter that suggested that they should move or all die, you sound like you're pretty knowing on this subject. So you can understand why the investigators are genuinely thinking this guy knows more than he should. Because bear in mind, the family did move out after the poisoning. Of course they did. They must have been absolutely terrified. And the investigators also found out about a number of details which, again, furthered George as a person of interest. So, for example, it's discovered that he has a degree in chemistry. They also found out that he had a criminal record, and it's not for petty shoplifting or anything like that. It's not for shouting at somebody because the music is too loud. It's not even for, I don't know, getting very aggressive after somebody tries to sell you a barbecue. We're talking about something a little bit more extreme. So in 1975, George was arrested, I kid you not, in Charlotte, South Carolina for running one of the largest methamphetamine labs in the Southeast. I mean, am I in an episode of Breaking Bad? Anyway, he was found guilty. He served 3 years in a federal prison for the crime. And one of the things that we have to take note from is he was known to use a particular method of cooking meth known as the P2P method. And that uses thallium in the process. And he was actually described as both the chemist and the mastermind of the group involved. So he's very clever, he's very competent, he's also very criminal. It was also found, ironically, that when he was in prison, when he was incarcerated, one of his real bugbears of the situation was when other prisoners were actually playing their music very loudly. So even in prison, that really affected his senses and sensibilities. And it could be, but both he and his wife are people who are very over-sensory stimulated. So things that shouldn't affect them really do. There are individuals who genuinely struggle on a mental health level with noise. And whereas you or I could handle the sound of music or even the sound of somebody else eating in a certain way, for these individuals, it's like a sensory overload. It's deeply frustrating, it's very aggravating, and it can actually create a level of rage within them. So he may fit that category. And in one instance, he was so upset by the noise, the music in prison, that he wrote to the warden about it. Although I don't think any action was taken. And I think the warden was like, George has got a point. Those radios, they have to go. We must have silence, and we must have only whispering. Whispering. In fact, staff, whisper from now on. But even though, obviously, he's not going to be listened to in that circumstance, it does speak to the level of annoyance it brings him that he's even writing to the particular governor about that, because he's trying to get something changed because he's finding it really difficult to manage. So like I said, it does speak to the position that he probably is incredibly sensitive to noise, and it is something that provokes quite a visceral, cerebral reaction. Now, the sheriff's office, during this investigation, they ask for a profile of the likely killer to be formed, and the profile is actually uncannily accurate. So they come up with the fact that it will be an intelligent white male who liked to resolve conflicts without direct confrontation. And to some degree, that does describe George when we think about his past. Now, at this stage, police do suspect that George has been responsible for the poisonings, but it's really debatable as to whether they're going to be able to get enough evidence to convict him, because there's nothing notable that they've found that suggests that he's directly linked. So they decide that what they need is an undercover operation. So they begin to investigate George using this undercover copper. It goes on for over a year, and a special agent, Susan Gorick, is put undercover. She's assigned to use the name Sherry, and the whole premise of this is that she needs to befriend George. Now, the way that she did this is she pretended to be a member of the Mensa group. Now, what I want to know is, did Sherry, or Susan, whichever way you want to call them in this case, did she have to do the Mensa test by going in and pretending that she was a member of actual Mensa, or was she just able to cleverly pretend that she was really that clever? I don't know. It's a quandary, isn't it? I would imagine that she just went in and acted clever. I'm not sure how you do that, but I'm sure, being an undercover agent, she was adept at it. Now, sadly, on March 3rd, 1989, Peggy actually died. and her cause of death was ruled as thanatoxicosis or thallium poisoning. Now, as I've said, Dwayne and Travis, they'd also been made really unwell. Fortunately, thank God, they both eventually recovered. But Dwayne was in hospital for 2 months, and Travis was in hospital for 6 months. You can't even begin to conceive of how ill they must have been to have spent that amount of time in hospital, and also just how lucky they were that they survived. Because the truth is, when you get that sick that you're in hospital for that period of time, it must have been touch and go for both of them. And the psychological scars of losing somebody they love deeply, but also almost losing their own lives, that must be absolutely horrific and traumatic to manage. And in such a left field way, when we consider poisonings, it's not something that you hear of regularly. And knowing that it's a silent killer, so to speak, that it could be in something you're drinking or eating, to have been an individual whose life has been made vulnerable by that, it must affect every choice that you make from that moment on, where you eat, who you eat with, and so on and so forth. The fallout and collateral damage of such a situation and circumstance must be immense. Now we get to April 1989. Bear in mind, this is just a little over a month after Peggy's death. The couple, George and Diana, they host this Mensa murder mystery weekend. And one could say there are some unsettling parallels to the poisoning that's just taken place. So George creates this booklet, and in this booklet he wrote for the participants, when a death threat appears on the doorstep, prudent people throw out all their food and watch what they eat. Hardly anyone dies from magic. Most items on the doorstep are just a neighbour's way of saying, I don't like you, move, or else. Is it just me? Or does that sound a little bit like an individual who is deeply arrogant and superior and just kind of wants to share what they've potentially done with the world in what they believe is a super clever way, which in this case is on a murder mystery weekend that they've created, which is fictional, but that sounds unusually, and as I said, uncannily, linked to a crime that has played out next door to them. But this is what happens. They get that leaflet, and obviously that's a very similar scenario to what happened to the Carr family. Now Sherry, this is where she intercepts George and Diana, the Trepals, at the event. This is where she becomes friends with them. And she also learns at that point that the couple are intending to move in the near future. And she actually ends up saying, well, you know what, that's really helpful, because she poses this situation where she needs to leave where she's living, and she could really do with finding a place to rent, and then it'd be really helpful if she could move into their house once they left. So she builds this alliance with George and Diana Trepal, and she spends time with them after the event. But he's tight-lipped. He never confesses to the murder. He doesn't provide any notable useful information. Susan, or Sherry as she's known, she does find clues that she feels disconcerted by, and that she feels are circumstantial to some degree, that do, as far as she's concerned, point towards George's guilt. So during one visit to the home, she notices an Agatha Christie novel that's lying on the table, The Pale Horse. Just going to say now, if you haven't read The Pale Horse and you're intending to, just fast forward, because I'm going to ruin it for you. For those of you who have, you will already know. For those of you who aren't interested in Agatha Christie, why not? But if you're not going to read the book, carry on watching. So in The Pale Horse, basically the novel's murderer used thallium to poison his victims. And so arguably that book is present, and that sparks her interest. And at one point, George suggests that Sherry poisons her husband because she's created this guise where she's really unhappy in the relationship with her husband and wants to leave him. And he's like, oh, just murder him by poison. Interestingly enough, when it comes down to serial killers, women do tend to kill people through poisoning. So it would be very much in keeping with the expectation of a female serial killer. But he's advising her, why don't you poison him? And she also found out that George made homemade wine, and he actually did indeed own a tool that could recap bottles. So that was also something that was in keeping with the Coca-Cola bottles that had obviously had their tops removed and the thallium put in there. But each of those could just be innocent, couldn't they? You can't get into trouble for having actually made homemade wine. It may be something that you absolutely do. There's nothing wrong in a fun scenario as throwing in the idea of poisoning a husband. You're not really meaning it, you're just saying it because you want to be empathic to the person who's struggling. And also a book about Agatha Christie where the main person within it is poisoning people with thallium. That's again just something that happens to be within a book because you're interested in the true crime or mystery crime or the fictional crime that actually you read about. So none of that's enough to actually indicate that he is in fact guilty. She did also find out that he was very educated around poisonous plants, and on one occasion when she brought up the poisonings, she said that he was very quiet, he was very thoughtful, and that usually he'd be super talkative as opposed to being quiet. So that struck her. But again, it happened next door. He'd been questioned by the police over it. He was probably a little bit paranoid anyway. We've seen that because of the way that he was in his student days. Maybe he just was quiet because he didn't want to say anything that could get him into any trouble, or he didn't really have anything to say because he didn't really know what had happened as far as he was concerned. So all of those, again, could mean that that discredits the suspicion and just puts him into acting in a way that isn't necessarily typical, but is completely understandable in such circumstances. We then get to November 1989. This is when George and Diana actually moved to Sebring in Florida. Diana had apparently been really unhappy with her medical practice for some time. Maybe they were playing their music too loud and she was attacking random people, who knows? So anyway, they relocate together so she can set up a new practice. And of course, this is ideal because Sherry has said that she wants to get away from her husband in her fake marriage, from her fake divorce potential, and now she's got a place to go because she's going to rent the home of George and Diana. And this is great, isn't it? Because this means that crime scene technicians can get in there. She's now in charge of that property. She can let them in. So on December the 12th, 1989, they search the house and there is a lot of incriminating information. So inside the garage, they find chemicals. I mean, lots and lots and lots. And how many chemicals do you need in a garage? Now, none of those were actually thallium, but they did find some empty bottles, one of which had this white powdery residue at the bottom of it. And so the bottle was sent off for testing. And then when it was sent off for testing, it was identified as having thallium nitrate on it. That was the residue. So that was the same kind that was used to poison Peggy Carr and her family. Also, they carried on searching around the house and they uncovered several poison and chemistry books. This included the pamphlet that apparently George had written called Chemistry for the Complete Idiot. That's the kind of chemistry that I would be reading, by the way. I'm sure a lot of you will identify with that. I need a book like that. If I'm going to read chemistry, I need somebody like George to have written a very simplified one that just specifically says, if you're an idiot and you're really bad at chemistry, this is for you. I like those guides. They tend to be a lot more simple. So yeah, he'd written this pamphlet saying Chemistry for the Complete Idiot, practical guide to all chemistry. They also found a 3-ring binder with the title General Poison Guide. And apparently it had photocopied pages from a book titled Poison Detection in Human Organs. And there was also another chapter that was from another book titled Death by Poison Synopsis. So he'd copied pages from those and they all included discussions on thallium. And it was clear that George was the person who'd been reading that because the actual information was all covered in George's fingerprints. So that's pretty incriminating when you're thinking about what we've covered in the case today. So we get to April 1990. At this point, they do consider they've got enough evidence against George. Yes, it's highly circumstantial, but nonetheless, they do believe that they've got enough. So George is charged at this point with the first-degree murder of Peggy, in addition to 6 counts of attempted murder, 7 counts of poisoning, and 1 count of tampering with a consumer product. So then we get to the 7th of January, 1991. At this point, George's trial takes place. It ends up taking a month to complete, and he pleads not guilty from the get-go. And this is going to be typical of him up until present day. he says not guilty. Now, his defence, it was based on the fact that the case against him was entirely circumstantial, and that, as far as they were concerned, the only piece of evidence against him was the bottle with the thallium residue that had been found in his unlocked garage. And their argument is anyone could have put that bottle there. Anyone. So their main argument was, listen, if you're blaming him, then you may as well just blame his wife, Diana Carr, because she's equally responsible for that property. She could equally have been the person who'd apparently done that if it was either of them, because anyone could have walked off the street and planted them there. So the defence is basically saying, yeah, you've got these little breadcrumb trail that you're saying all links directly to their client, in this case George, but actually you could deflect that onto any number of other people, because the garage was unlocked and Diana Carr is also medically trained and she was present. So how are you hanging this on him? Well, I guess it's the pamphlet and the murder mystery stuff and the fact that he was a chemist and the fact that he went to prison for quite a serious drugs charge and the fact that he did tell investigators that maybe the reason that the Carrs were going to leave was because, you know, they were being threatened for their life and that could be a way of getting rid of them. Those kind of things might contribute. But aside from those, it's all circumstantial, all of it. What about the actual printed copies of the thing about thallium poisoning? Circumstantial. What about the fact that there seems to be a lot of links directly to him not liking the next door neighbours, and that he's very highly trained in this area, and that he's basically the one who seems to have the most evidence in his direction suggesting that he's the likely candidate and culprit? Circumstantial. It's circumstantial. Anyway, that's their defence. Now, over 70 witnesses spoke at the trial against George, and this was all about establishing that he had a motive for the murders because he didn't like the Carrs. So one witness who does some gardening for George and Diana, he had actually heard George making threats and actually shouting at the Carr children multiple times. In one instance, he heard him saying, "I will get them," and another said, "I'm going to kill you." The latter apparently occurred when the children rode motorcycles through George's lawn. With respect, I don't think that you can use that against somebody. I am not the kind of person who's ever threatened a child for going on a bike across my lawn. But I am the child of a father who was incredibly lovely, and if you dared to walk past our house and lean in our bushes, let me tell you, that man could get from the lounge to that spot in what could only be considered some kind of time speed deviation. He was warp speed, I'm telling you. You did not want to come into contact with my father's hedges. There would be strict consequences, believe me. The local kids were really scared. He was very typical and particular about his garden. What I'm saying is, when people say those things, they're not necessarily meaning it, and actually your kids should not be riding motorcycles through your neighbour's garden. That's terrible, terrible parenting, in my opinion, and needs to be brought into check, because your kids should know better than that. So I understand his frustrations may lead him to say things that are really aggressive and aren't intentional, but nonetheless, that is brought in against him. Then John Schaffer, he bought the Carrs home after the actual poisoning. He said that George had actually told him that the Carr children were disrespectful, they were kind of redneckish, and that they apparently weren't disciplined. And he said that there was basically big social differences between his family and theirs. There clearly were. And let's be honest, it is disrespectful and it isn't disciplined if you are riding motorcycles through somebody's garden. It also shouldn't lead to them being poisoned. That would be illogical. The leap of what they need corrected versus, well, we're correcting you by almost killing you, it just doesn't actually make sense. Also, there were lots of instances where the Carrs had been playing music loudly, often outside, and George had actually repeatedly gone round to ask them to turn it down. On some occasions, they would do that, but on others, they wouldn't, and clearly George and Diana both found that very difficult. And they actually spoke to Peggy about how loud the music was in one instance, but apparently Peggy said that she didn't have to tell her children to turn it down. And Pye's first wife, who'd also lived at that address, she said that she had on one occasion seen George stomping his foot and throwing sticks because the Carr's dogs were in his yard. Apparently he didn't like dogs and she knew that. Again, I don't think there is something untoward about trying to get somebody else's dogs out of your yard. however you need to get them out of your yard. Again, I don't necessarily think that is fair as a witness testimony. Oh, this guy's really awful for wanting to get somebody else's dogs out of his yard and he doesn't know how to, so he's stamping his feet and he's using sticks. Like, he's trying to get dogs out of a yard. The dogs shouldn't be in the yard. So I'm not trying to be nasty about the cars, but they don't sound like the easiest neighbours at that point to live around, particularly if you have a really sensitive temperament. I'm not defending any actions such as poisoning, it's awful, but I am understanding and being sympathetic to somebody actually going and asking for a bit of neighbourly respect. And if you don't get it, obviously it's going to incite a sense of anger. And those kind of levels of anger often can be managed. But I guess for some people, they could spill out to making them think about doing things that are very extreme to achieve their goal of getting rid of them. And in one incident, George had actually reported the cars to the zoning board. So Pi apparently hadn't acquired a permit for converting his garage into an apartment. However, Pi had actually gone on to obtain a retrospective permit for this. I guess that would have really incensed George. He would have seen that Pi had broken the rules, and then he had tried to level that by telling the zoning place that that was something that had happened. And then they're like, oh, it's okay. So Pi gets his way. And I guess that that's one of the things that features in the frustration that George is feeling, that Pi is doing things that he doesn't feel is neighbourly or fair or rule orientated, and he's getting away with it. Now, it was suspected that George had sent the threatening letter that the family had received that previous June. And one of the reasons for this is basically the way it's addressed. So the address in the letter listed Bartow, Florida, instead of Alturas. So the houses were actually located in Alturas, but they were actually on the Bartow mailing route. So you'd have to be familiar with that. If you had a Bartow mailing address, it would be because you lived on that street, even though you were in the Alturas locality, and it wasn't common knowledge. But if you were living next door, such as George was to the cars, he would have been aware of this and he would have labelled it correctly. And you can imagine a character like George making sure it was absolutely correct within the detail, because he was quite a detail-orientated person. And then another reason that they feel that he was the person who sent the letter was due to that suspicious answer he gave during his police interview, because he'd said that perhaps someone wanted them to move out of their house. And then when he was asked about why people might have wanted to poison the cars, he had said it in such a way that the wording was actually strikingly similar to that of a threatening letter. Equally, it could be that he did indeed send that letter, but he didn't poison them. He could have just sent it because he wanted to scare them. So that doesn't actually necessitate that he is the guilty party, more that it necessitates that he is an annoyed party and he wants to get rid of the neighbours. Doesn't necessarily equate to him poisoning them. Then they seek further evidence regarding what they believe is George's guilt. So obviously he's got the substantial understanding of chemistry that in itself could make him a suspect. But they found chemistry laboratory equipment, toxic and dangerous chemicals. They found a journal about poison detection in humans, and they also found thallium in his home, which does feel relatively incriminating. Also, they found that antique bottle capper. He said, like I said, that it was for wine that he made, but it could have been used to replace the Coca-Cola bottle lids. They bring in about the copy of Agatha Christie's Pale Horse novel. It's not a strong indicator of guilt, but because the novel contains that description of using thallium to poison people, obviously a jury might find that relatively compelling, but it could equally be coincidental. And then Special Agent Susan Gorrick, who was obviously working undercover, she said that one of the things that was striking for her was that George genuinely fitted the poisoner's profile well. So he would back away from people that he took issue with, that he was non-confrontational, so he was far more likely to do something underhanded than to actually engage in conflict. Although, again, let's be clear, many of us don't want to engage in conflict, particularly if we've not necessarily got the physical strength to be somebody who could take a situation escalating, because these things happen. You have to be pretty sure of yourself, or pretty, shall we say, quick to rise to engage in conflict. Lots of us would choose not to. We might feel frustrated, we might vent our frustration in certain ways, but just because we aren't willing to get involved in a direct conflict doesn't mean that we're willing to murder somebody. Now, the prosecution, John Aguirre, he said that George thought he was basically too intelligent to be caught. He said, here is a man who thought he was so smart, he could literally get away with murder. He also said that to believe Mr. Trepal to be innocent, you would have to believe all of these things to just be pure coincidences. Now, the defense, they basically argued that Diana could easily have been responsible, but that really unnerved and upset George. He said that he didn't want the finger pointed at her, and they really based their defense on, as I said earlier on, everything against George was purely circumstantial. Although, I mean, do you know, to the untrained, unschooled eye, it seems highly coincidental, if we're going to use that word, and rather strange that it had all the implements that were required, including instruction manuals to poison people, and the people next door get poisoned if it wasn't actually him who was the poisoner. It just feels a little bit too much in the direction of George to have fell on the shoulders of anybody else when it comes down to what happened to the Carr family. So when the jury go out to deliberate, it takes them 6 hours of deliberations, and they come back and they find him guilty of both the murder, the attempted murder, and the tampering charges. So basically he gets found guilty of every single charge. And like I said, if you had been sitting on that jury, you've listened to all those expert testimonies, and on top of that, you know that he's schooled in this area. He's somebody who is capable on a level academically to actually carry these things out. And he had these deep frustrations with his neighbours. Even though it's circumstantial, it's strong. We get to the 6th of March, 1991, and George Trepal was actually sentenced to death. Now, in 1996, so that's 5 years after he gets that sentence, Diana divorces George. Don't get me wrong, she defended him throughout. She was a staunch believer. She believed he was innocent, full stop. Her belief in him apparently never wavered. Still, I guess she was being held back by the fact that she was married to somebody who was, I don't know, on death row, and it was decided that it was best to vacate the situation. Now, in 1997, the Office of the Inspector General of the United States Department of Justice, the OIG, they released a report which basically criticised Roger Marrs and also some of his work in the chemistry toxicology unit of the FBI laboratory. They described it as being seriously flawed. Now, this was very relevant to George's case because Roger had actually testified against him. He'd said that his tests had shown that thallium nitrate was added without any dispute to the Coca-Cola. And bear in mind, when experts testify, there is a huge amount of weight given to them. The jury are looking at them as the chosen expert. They are believing what they are saying. They are convinced because usually the testimony is highly compelling. If you have a strong and confident expert, even under cross-examination, they hold their fort. They do it in a way where they are convincing and confident. It's really hard for the jury to hear anything against them because genuinely you think this person knows what they're saying, and if they project in a positive manner where you believe what they are saying to be true, it's going to convince you that they know exactly what they are saying. So if a jury has heard that information, sure, that is definitely going to blur their opinion when it comes down to the case. So he had said that the thallium nitrate was added to the Coca-Cola and that the white powder in George's garage was also thallium. And Roger was apparently accused of overstating the significance of the analytical results of the laboratory tests and also, quote, making various inaccurate, incomplete and unsupported statements. So that basically means the guy got on the stand and made stuff up. That's what they're saying. They can dress it up in as many words as they like. They're saying the guy was talking rubbish at times and just saying things that weren't supported in science. So this means that George at that point had the grounds to file a post-conviction motion. He argued that he had the right to a new trial in light of this very new and important information. We get to 2003. It is concluded that Roger's improper testimony did not have a substantial and injurious effect or influence in determining the jury's verdict. So basically his death penalty was upheld and he wasn't granted a new trial. The judge wrote that Roger Martz's conduct at trial was outrageous and shocking, and the apparent lack of supervision which allowed this misconduct is troubling, which you'd think was a pretty profound statement when we're thinking that individuals may have ended up on death row because of that testimony. But like I said, despite this, the evidence against George was apparently so strong that it was considered doubtful that a different sentence would have been given, even in light of the misconduct. Which, I'm not saying, by the way, that George is anything but guilty. I'm just saying I would be pissed if some expert had been brought in, wheeled in and gone, definitely this particular poison, definitely the residue is linked in this garage to what was found in the Coca-Cola, definitely was in the Coca-Cola. And then it turns out that that was BS. I would feel that that was something that should give me a retrial, because what if the jury hadn't been informed by this apparent massive expert that this definitely was the case? Would that have been enough to make them feel a sense of reasonable doubt? And that's what George, and no doubt his defence team, would want to be able to convey, that we were put in a position where this was taken as fact and it's actually fiction. Now, in spite of that, he hasn't been given a new trial. They don't believe it would have additionalised the actual result being different to what the result was, i.e. guilty on all charges. But nonetheless, this is something that they tried to push forward. And like I said, it is harrowing and heinous when experts that are given so much power and control, and where people genuinely do believe that what they are saying is absolutely fact, and it turns out that, like I said, it's fiction. Because even though George may 100% be guilty in this case, it undermines that result just from the outside looking in. He can be guilty as hell, but it means that other people will question that. And when you think about a family who've lost people that they love, they don't want that level of undermining, particularly when it comes down to a death penalty case. Now, Pykar, who's obviously one of the victims in this case, he lost his partner. Also, people in his family were very badly affected by the poisoning. He said he wants to be there when George is executed, but he said he hasn't got anything to specifically say to him. He said, I don't think I could control myself if I was to talk to him. Dwayne, who is obviously impacted, described George as a psycho genius. He said that he took away his mother, who died a terrible death. I mean, how awful for Dwayne. He watched his mother die in the most horrific of ways and then was affected dreadfully himself. He also said that he remembers her being so poorly that he had to carry her into the hospital. Now, though George has absolutely 100%, as I said earlier on, maintained his innocence throughout, and don't get me wrong, some people in his life do believe in his innocence. So one of his friends, who still visits him in prison, he says George had never been violent. He said he's not the sort of person that would do that. He also recounted a time where George had been beaten up and he just stood there. But I'm going to throw it out, that's not that convincing. So you're saying that because George stood there when he was beaten up by somebody, it means he's not violent? Yes. I just think probably he was a bit scared and the guy was stronger than him. That's also possible. Also, can I bring you back to the fact that he used to put hallucinogenics on doorknobs and spike people who he pitched up hitchhiking? It's not the nicest thing to do. You have a point, but he did it very quietly in a non-violent, pacificative way. So I don't think he's that violent or dangerous. I think he was quite violent and dangerous, drugging people against their will. Anyway, his friend feels that way, so I'm just bringing it in because to always address balance, it's important we get those points of view as well. But I, on a personal level, when I think about him as a human being, don't think that he would want to engage in fighting because he doesn't look like it's somebody who'd be able to win in a physical fight. Like I said, he's somebody who's a bit more sinister in the way that he assaults you, silently, on door handles, or in cookies that he's made. So then we've got Larry Double-E, that's Peggy's ex-husband. So, as we know, Peggy remarried Pye, but even though the pair had been divorced in 1976, they'd actually stayed in contact, they stayed on friendly terms. That says something lovely about Peggy as well. And he actually said that he has his doubts regarding George's guilt. He said that he's conflicted. He doesn't know what to believe. He said that even though some of his family is absolutely convinced that George is responsible, that during the investigations, Larry had actually reported that around a month before Peggy's illness, she complained to him about Pi. She said she was scared of him. She said that she was considering leaving him. And it also came to light that when his son Dwayne and Peggy were in hospital, Larry had also slept at the hospital because he didn't want Pi to be alone with Dwayne. And doubly, Peggy's son, who was in the Navy, he used to send letters to his mum, and he also said that a month before Peggy was admitted to hospital, the tone of her letters changed. She said that she wanted to visit him, but she wanted it to be kept a secret. They also constructed a code word which she would use to let him know that she was coming. And she said that she needed some time away from the house because she was nervous and she was scared and she needed to be by herself. Later, she actually said that she didn't want Pi to know that they'd had these conversations. She wanted it to be kept a secret. And the lead detective on the case told Alan to hold that thought when he suggested that they needed to look at Pi a little closer just to make sure they see everything, weigh everything. Alan even offered to testify about this information, but he wasn't actually called to do so. It was also reported that Peggy believed that Pi was having an affair. Now, when Pi was interviewed, he was apparently trembling and extremely nervous, so much so that he could barely speak. There was also a letter found in a bin in the car home to Pi from Peggy, which did indicate that there were some marital issues. And this note wasn't apparently disclosed to George's defence team, which is very concerning because that meant it wasn't presented as evidence in court. Surely that would have been relevant in the case. When it comes down to domestic situations, when homicide occurs, with respect, it does tend to be somebody that that individual is close to. And even though I'm not saying for a minute that Pi was the individual responsible for it, I'm saying that in court, the defence should have been able to have that to show that there were issues within the marital relationship, because that could have again caused some doubt where the jury was concerned when it came down to the conviction of George. So this is a little bit concerning, and certainly I think that that particular note could have meant that more attention was given to Pi. Now, whilst Pi was, as you'd expect initially, a suspect, there wasn't considered enough concrete evidence, whereas there was, let's be honest, an abundance of evidence against George. However, without a doubt, the most incriminating evidence against George, the bottle of thallium, that was actually found in his house when he didn't live there anymore. It was also discovered in an unlocked garage over a year after the poisonings took place. So some people believe that it was planted. Some people believe that anybody, including the poisoner, could have walked in off the street and placed that bottle there. And how firm is the evidence when 12 months has passed? Because it was damning, but was it damning toward the correct party? Now, it does sound to me like the cars did things that would have annoyed anyone. You know, they played the music too loud. Maybe George had complained, and maybe the cars had been upset that he was complaining. He was a nitpicking neighbour, and they actually increased their behaviour to antagonise him because they wanted to annoy him because he was frustrating. But if you even put it into that context where they were doing things like driving their motorcycles over his lawn or allowing their dogs to chase his cats, but at the end of the day, to actually resort to poisoning from a petty amount of inconveniences is incredibly extreme. Also, George did end up moving away after the poisoning, and his wife Diana said that they'd been looking to move away from the area prior to the incident. And that does make me think that that's quite bizarre, isn't it? To resort to murder if they were actually planning on leaving anyway. Not saying that murderers are ever that logical. I'm just saying they were obviously talking about moving because she was unhappy too. He wanted to go away. They did indeed leave. So why resort to killing your neighbours that way? Now, George has understandably appealed his death sentence numerous times. He remains on death row in Union Correctional Institution in Rayford, Florida. He has been there 4 decades, longer than many people in the UK serve for a murder term. So he's not dead yet. He's not been put to death yet. He may not be put to death. Who knows? Or he may. Like I said, he said from day one he didn't do it. I will leave it up to you guys to decide whether he's guilty as hell or maybe a victim of circumstance or a lot of circumstantial evidence. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, guys. As ever, I hope you've found today's case interesting. I'll see you again. Always release my content on a Wednesday and Sunday. Crime and consistency is my catchphrase. See you again next time. Be safe.